On a quiet summer morning in Strongsville, Ohio, the air was still and the streets were mostly empty. It was July 31st, 2022, and most people in this peaceful suburb of Cleveland were still asleep. But in the early hours of that morning, something happened that would shatter the calm of this community forever and send shockwaves across the entire country. A car carrying three young people accelerated to an unthinkable speed on a residential road and slammed into the side of a brick building with such force that two of the passengers never made it out alive. The driver survived. And from that single moment, a question was born that would consume courtrooms' news headlines and eventually a Netflix documentary watched by millions of people around the world. Was it an accident? Or was it murder? Mackenzie Shirilla was 17 years old at the time of the crash. By all outward appearances, she was a typical teenage girl living in suburban Ohio. She had a boyfriend named Dominic Russo, who was 20 years old, and a mutual friend named Davian Flanagan, who was 19. The three of them had spent time together that night before the early morning hours brought them to a moment that none of them could have predicted. At least, that is what Shirilla would later claim. But investigators would come to see the events of that morning in a very different light, a light that painted a picture not of a tragic accident, but of something far more deliberate and far more chilling. The crash happened on Alameda Drive in Strongsville. Shirilla was behind the wheel of a 2018 Toyota Camry. The car was traveling at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour on a road with a posted speed limit of just 35 miles per hour. There were no skid marks. There was no evidence of braking. The car did not swerve to avoid the building. It went straight into it at full speed. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were pronounced dead at the scene. Shirilla was pulled from the wreckage alive with multiple broken bones. The first responders who arrived at the scene described what they found as one of the most devastating crash sites they had ever encountered. Brett Stanislaw, a firefighter who responded to the scene, testified later about the horror of what he found that morning. The car had been reduced to a mangled wreck embedded in the side of a brick building. Another first responder described initially believing that all three people in the vehicle were dead. It was only when he heard mumbling coming from inside the wreckage that he realized Shirilla was still alive. The fire department used specialized tools to extract all three people from what remained of the vehicle. For Russo and Flanagan, it was already too late. For Shirilla, the physical injuries were severe but survivable. The emotional and legal consequences of that morning, however, would follow her for the rest of her life. In the immediate aftermath, investigators began the painstaking process of trying to understand what had happened. At first, the crash was treated as a tragic accident. Three young people out late at night, a car traveling too fast, and a catastrophic collision. But as detectives dug deeper into the evidence, something began to feel very wrong. The data recorder inside the Toyota Camry told a story that did not match the narrative of a simple accident. According to expert testimony from a crash reconstruction specialist, the vehicle had been accelerating in the seconds before impact. At no point in the 4.6 seconds before the crash was the brake pedal applied. The car was not slowing down. It was speeding up, and the steering had been turned deliberately toward the building. Investigators from the Ohio State Highway Patrol Crash Reconstruction Unit analyzed the black box data from the vehicle and concluded that Shirilla had pressed the accelerator to full throttle and made a hard steering input to the right in the final moments before impact. This was not the profile of a driver who had lost control. This was the profile of a driver who had chosen a direction and committed to it. The prosecution would later argue in court that these findings proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Mackenzie Shirilla had intentionally driven the car into that building with the full knowledge that it would kill the people inside it. As the investigation widened, detectives began looking into the relationship between Shirilla and Dominic Russo. What they found painted a complicated and troubling picture. The two had been in a relationship that friends and family described as intense and at times volatile. Text messages, Phone recordings and social media posts began to emerge that suggested the relationship had been under serious strain in the days leading up to the crash. Russo had reportedly been considering ending the relationship. His mother, Christine, would later testify in court about recordings her son had made just days before the crash. Those recordings portrayed Shirilla as combative and threatening. The prosecution built a theory around this dynamic, arguing that Shirilla had driven into that building as an act of murder and intended suicide driven by the fear of losing Russo. For the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, the weeks and months after the crash were consumed by grief so profound it was almost impossible to put into words. Russo was 20 years old. Flanagan was 19. Both had their entire lives ahead of them. Flanagan had recently graduated from Strongsville High School. Russo was described by those who loved him as protective and full of life. Their families were left to make sense of a loss that made no sense at all. And then when investigators began to suggest that the crash may not have been an accident, that grief was layered with something even harder to process. The possibility that the person driving the car had meant for this to happen. Shirilla was eventually arrested and charged with murder. The charges were serious and numerous. In total, she faced 12 felony counts, including 2 counts of murder and multiple counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, as well as other related charges. The case drew national attention almost immediately. Here was a 17-year-old girl charged with the murders of her boyfriend and his friend in a case built almost entirely on physical evidence and a theory of motive rooted in a troubled relationship. Shirilla maintained from the very beginning that she had not intentionally caused the crash. She maintained that she had no memory of what happened that morning, and her defense team pointed to a medical explanation for what the prosecution was calling a deliberate act of violence. The defense argued that Shirilla had been previously diagnosed with a condition called POTS, which stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. This is a disorder that affects blood flow and can cause dizziness, lightheadedness, and in some cases loss of consciousness. Her family and legal team argued that on the morning of the crash, Shirilla had been dehydrated and that her condition had caused her to black out behind the wheel. Her mother, Natalie Shirilla, spoke about the diagnosis and its potential effects. The defense presented this as a credible medical explanation for why the car had behaved the way it did in those final seconds. But the prosecution countered that the sustained acceleration and the deliberate steering input recorded by the black box would simply not have been possible if the driver had lost consciousness. In August 2023, the case went to trial. Shirilla had opted for a bench trial, meaning the verdict would be decided by a judge rather than a jury. The judge presiding over the case was Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Judge Nancy Margaret Russo. After hearing all of the evidence, Judge Russo delivered a verdict that was both decisive and devastating for the defense. She found Mackenzie Shirilla guilty on all 12 felony counts, every single charge. In delivering her ruling from the bench, Judge Russo did not hold back. She described Shirilla in language that was striking in its directness and its force. She called Shirilla, quote, hell on wheels. She referenced the surveillance footage of the crash that had been gathered by investigators and said that the video clearly showed the purpose and intent of the defendant. Judge Russo described how Shirilla had transformed from what appeared to be a responsible driver into something entirely different in the moments before the crash. She noted that Shirilla had chosen an obscure route to drive that morning, a route that investigators discovered she had visited just days before the crash, a route that was not one she regularly used. The judge pointed out that Shirilla had also chosen to make the drive in the early hours of the morning when few people would be around to witness what happened or to offer help afterward. All of these details, combined with the physical evidence from the black box, led Judge Russo to conclude that this had been a deliberate act, that Mackenzie Shirilla alone had made the decision to drive that car at 100 miles per hour into a brick building. The sentencing that followed was equally severe. Shirilla was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. She received credit for the time she had already spent in jail awaiting trial, which amounted to nearly a year. She was remanded to the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, Ohio, where she remains to this day. Her first parole hearing is not scheduled until September 2037, when she will be 33 years old. For the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but no relief from the grief that had become a permanent part of their lives. At the sentencing, Russo's mother delivered an impact statement that was heartbreaking in its rawness and its pain. She told the court that her heart was forever broken. She ended her statement with words that cut straight to the heart of what the prosecution had argued throughout the trial. She said that Mackenzie had shown no mercy on Dominic, nor had she on Davion. These were not the words of someone who believed the crash had been an accident. They were the words of a mother who had lost her son and who believed she knew exactly who was responsible and why. Following her conviction, Shirilla's legal team moved quickly to pursue an appeal. They filed paperwork challenging the verdict and seeking a new trial. But the appeal process did not go smoothly. In a significant legal setback, the 8th District Court of Appeals ruled in 2024 that Shirilla's petition for a new trial was invalid. The reason was both simple and devastating for the defense. Her attorney had filed the appeal paperwork one day after the 365-day jurisdictional deadline mandated by Ohio law. One single day. And because of that, the court ruled it had no jurisdiction to consider the appeal at all. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo agreed with this reasoning and declared the petition invalid. The defense did not give up. They continued to push through the legal system. But in March 2026, the 8th District Court of Appeals once again upheld the decision to deny the appeal. The court affirmed the original ruling. The conviction stood. The sentence stood. And Mackenzie Shirilla remained in prison with no immediate legal avenue to challenge the verdict that had changed the course of her life. Her attorneys have not publicly disclosed whether they intend to pursue further legal action. But as of now, every avenue that has been tried has been closed. Then in May 2026, something changed the public conversation around this case in a dramatic and sweeping way. Netflix released a documentary called The Crash. The film premiered on May 15, 2026, and almost immediately became one of the most watched true crime documentaries on the platform. The Crash revisited the events of July 31, 2022 from the beginning, examining the evidence, the investigation, the trial, and the lives of everyone touched by the tragedy. It featured interviews with people who had been at the center of the case from the very start. Dominic Russo's father, Frank, and his sister, Christine, spoke in the documentary. Davion Flanagan's father, Scott Flanagan, also appeared. And so did Shirilla's own parents, Steve and Natalie Shirilla, who have never wavered in their belief that their daughter is innocent. But the most striking and talked about element of the crash was the inclusion of Mackenzie Shirilla herself. In what was described as her first interview since entering prison, Shirilla sat down with the documentary makers and spoke about her relationship with Russo, about the crash, and about her life behind bars. The interview was conducted at the Ohio Reformatory for Women and lasted only 1 hour. Her lawyer was present throughout. Shirilla spoke about Russo with what appeared to be genuine emotion. She said that if things had been different, they would have probably been married by now. She described him as protective and loving. She acknowledged that their relationship had its rocky moments, but insisted it was fundamentally good. When the conversation turned to the crash itself, Shirilla's position remained unchanged from what it had been since the very beginning. She said she had no recollection of that morning, no memory of driving, no memory of the impact, no memory of anything. She pointed again to her POTS diagnosis as the most logical explanation for what happened. Her mother echoed this in her own interview, explaining the nature of the condition and how it could cause a person to lose consciousness without warning. But Shirilla also said something that struck many viewers as contradictory and troubling. She said she had no recollection of that morning, but she knew it was not intentional. How someone with no memory of an event can be certain of the intent behind it is a question that the documentary does not answer and that Shirilla herself does not fully explain. She also made a statement that has been widely discussed and debated since the documentary aired. She said, quote, "I am not saying I am innocent. I was a driver of a tragedy. But I am not a murderer." These words landed differently for different viewers. For some, they represented a young woman grappling with the complexity of her situation, trying to acknowledge that something terrible happened while still refusing to accept the label of murderer. For others, they sounded like a carefully constructed statement designed to create legal and moral distance from the verdict that had been handed down by a court of law. The debate around these words reflects the broader debate that has surrounded this case from the very beginning. The documentary also revealed details about Shirilla's life before the crash and the dynamics of her relationship with Russo that had been central to the prosecution's case. Surveillance footage, text messages, and social media content were all examined. The film explored the question at the heart of everything. Where does a fatal mistake end and cold-blooded murder begin? It is a question that the documentary does not answer definitively, because perhaps it cannot be answered definitively. But it lays out the evidence and lets the viewer sit with the weight of it. Outside the prison walls, the release of the crash set off a chain of consequences that extended well beyond Shirilla herself. Social media exploded with reaction. Viewers took sides passionately and sometimes viciously. Some declared Shirilla guilty beyond any doubt and expressed outrage that she would appear on camera and continue to maintain her innocence. Others rallied around her, insisting that the verdict had been wrong and that she was a victim of a justice system that had failed to properly consider the medical evidence. Free Mackenzie Shirilla pages appeared and grew rapidly on Facebook and TikTok. A statement posted on Shirilla's behalf from inside prison urged her supporters to keep fighting and to seek out what she called the truth of what actually happened. The statement ended with a selfie of Shirilla and a call for people to follow the support pages on social media. Many observers noted that the statement showed little of the remorse that the court had found to be absent throughout the original trial. Then on May 18, 2026, a new development emerged that added yet another layer to an already complex story. Shirilla's father, Steve Shirilla, was placed on administrative leave from his position as an art and digital media teacher at Mary Queen of Peace School in Cleveland. The school sent a letter to parents explaining that it was investigating allegations that one of its teachers had demonstrated poor judgment. The allegations were tied to comments Steve Shirilla had made on social media following the release of the documentary. The school stated that upon learning of the allegations, it acted immediately and placed the teacher on administrative leave. A parent speaking anonymously to local news said that students had genuinely liked and respected Steve Shirilla as a teacher, but that the way the family had handled the public attention around the case and the documentary had drawn a negative light to the school and created what they described as a scary amount of attention directed at the children who attended there. Steve Shirilla has been a consistent and vocal supporter of his daughter throughout this entire ordeal. He has told reporters that he believes Mackenzie is innocent and that there is more to the story than what has been presented in court and in the media. His wife Natalie has appeared in the documentary to support the same position. For them, this is not a story about a murderer. It is a story about a young woman who suffered a medical emergency behind the wheel of a car and who has been imprisoned for something that was beyond her control. That belief has not changed despite every court ruling that has gone against their daughter. For the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, the Netflix documentary has been its own kind of ordeal. Notably, the mothers of both victims chose not to appear in the film. Christine Russo and Jaime Flanagan both declined to participate, and the documentary does not explain why. What is known is that at the trial, Christine Russo delivered an impact statement so raw and so filled with pain that it became one of the most remembered moments of the entire legal proceedings. She spoke of a heart forever broken. She spoke of a son who was gone, and she spoke of a young woman who she believed had shown no mercy. Whether she watched the documentary that put Mackenzie Shirilla back in the spotlight after the appeal had failed is not known. What is known is that for these families, the case is not a true crime story. It is their lives. It is the absence of their sons at every family gathering, every birthday, every milestone that will never now be reached. As things stand today, Mackenzie Shirilla is 21 years old, and she is in prison. She has been convicted of murder by a court of law. Every appeal she has pursued has been denied. Her father has been placed on administrative leave from his job because of the attention her case has generated. A Netflix documentary about her crime has become one of the most talked about true crime releases of 2026, and her first chance at parole is still more than a decade away. The question of what really happened on Alameda Drive in the early hours of July 31st, 2022, remains a subject of fierce debate among the public. But in the eyes of the law, the answer has been given. A judge looked at the evidence and called it murder. And that verdict has been upheld at every level of appeal that has been attempted. What makes this case so enduringly compelling is not just the shocking nature of the crash itself. It is the collision of competing narratives that refuse to fully resolve. There is the narrative of the prosecution, which says a young woman in a volatile relationship drove a car at 100 miles per hour into a brick building because she could not face the possibility of being left behind. There is the narrative of the defense, which says a young woman with a documented medical condition lost consciousness behind the wheel and has been imprisoned for something her body did without her knowledge or consent. And there is the narrative of the victims' families, which says that two young men who had done nothing wrong got into a car and never came home, and that the person responsible for that is now in prison where she belongs. None of these narratives are simple, none of them are without emotion, and none of them are going away. The crash on Netflix has introduced this story to an entirely new audience around the world. People who had never heard of Strongsville, Ohio, or Mackenzie Shirilla, or Dominic Russo, or Davion Flanagan are now watching the footage, asking the questions, and forming their own conclusions. And the conversation is louder now than it has been at any point since the original trial. For Mackenzie Shirilla, the next chapter of her story will not be written in a courtroom or on a Netflix screen. It will be written in the Ohio Reformatory for Women day by day, year by year. She says she thinks about Dom and Davion constantly. She says she tries to wake up every day and be the best person she can be. She says there is a void in her life from losing them. Whether those words are the words of someone who loved them and lost them in a tragedy she could not control, or the words of someone who took them and is now performing a version of grief for the cameras, is something that each viewer of this story must decide for themselves. What is certain is this. Two young men named Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan got into a car on a summer morning in Strongsville, Ohio, and they never came home. Their families have been changed forever. Their community has been changed forever. And the young woman who was behind the wheel that morning will spend at least the next decade of her life inside a prison, trying to convince a world that is watching that she is not who the court said she is. Whether she succeeds in that effort or not, the memory of that morning on Alameda Drive will not fade. The brick wall is still there. The families are still grieving. And the questions that were born on July 31st, 2022 are still being asked.